Hello, Alexis. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Leslie. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So we're going to dive right in and hear your story. And your story is we start at the beginning, as you know, which is how were you raised religiously or spiritually? Kind of how was that held in your family system? And as well as like you experienced it.
hmm So I actually had a bit of an interesting, interesting might be an understatement for my childhood in many ways. But I was adopted, and I have two adoptive mothers. One of them was Jewish and Reform Jewish, and the other one was Catholic. And I actually later found out, like when I was a little bit older, that my mom actually attempted to become a nun at some point. And there was like a whole saga that went along with her, like how like she didn't become a nun. But I was raised Roman Catholic, and the reason why they ended up opting to raise my sibling and I Catholic was because we were living in Chattanooga, Tennessee at the time. My Jewish parent, Hilly, often called it Chattanowhere because at the time nobody knew where in the hell Chattanooga was. And the nearest synagogue was a good 30 minutes to an hour away. I can't remember how far Atlanta is from Chattanooga, but it was in Atlanta. And that's a really long drive to like take children, let alone like, day school and stuff, for, yeah, Torah school, whatever it's called. Oops. I can't remember. I should know that, but yeah. So the Catholic Church was basically like the best option because they basically looked at each other and said, who knows more? And off to
Interesting.
Catholic.
So it wasn't because one felt stronger about it. It was simply convenience, which fair enough, right?
Yeah.
You're raising two kids, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Um, and this is what was there. And if
Mhm.
she wanted to be a nun, she did feel deeply her religion.
Yeah, it's interesting because, having same-sex parents who were in, I've never really entirely been clear as to what was going on with their relationship, like, because that's their business. Um, but I do know that they were both queer. They were both gay. um, at the minimum, like it was, my mother had a very difficult relationship with the Catholic Church because
Yeah.
obviously the Catholic Church is not exactly known for being friendly to gay people and to gay families.
Hmm.
But my mother did have her own personal relationship with her spirituality, and it was important to her. And it was important to them that we be raised with some sort of like moral structure to at least build on.
Hmm.
And also being in Tennessee, it was also a matter of like pragmatism too, because the public schools weren't that great.
Hmm.
So sending us to private Catholic school, which is something that they had the means to do, was the pragmatic choice to ensure that we had like a decent education and, had the resources that we needed as children. So no, it wasn't ever, Judaism or is better than Catholicism or this is better than that. It was really just what's practical in the moment. And my parents were never particularly uh, demonstrative like with their spiritual beliefs, and they weren't also like they weren't impositional either. So when fast forward about 12, 13 years, when I first sort of started to explore spirituality on my own, when I came to my mom and I said I'm a witch and I'm practicing Wicca, she was just like, what's that? You're not going to be sacrificing cats in the backyard, are you? And I was just like, no, mom. And she's like, okay, cool, whatever. You do you, baby.
So there was no there. So did they either of them have an interest in you being Jewish or being Catholic?
No,
So they
like,
weren't in the home, like it was a good thing out in the world. Did you
mhm.
go to Sunday school or was it just
I
school?
did, yes, I did go to catechism
Mhm.
right up until about middle school. And the reason why we stopped going was because We were sort of like at the age of maturity. So like my brother and I were like 13, 14 years old. And the Catholic church that we had been parishioners at started to take a very kind of like hard right turn. And it made my mother very uncomfortable. And my brother had some very contentious experiences with catechism classes and with his catechism teacher, some of which in hindsight were a little bit racially questionable now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But like he was very deeply uncomfortable. I just didn't care. Like I told my mom, I was just like, I don't rock with Jesus that way.
Yeah.
Like I'm going for you.
It's beautiful that they listened to you guys. They really wanted to protect your brother and you and say, okay, well, we gave it a shot. We give you guys this foundation.
Yeah.
And it's not calling to you and things are going awry.
Yeah.
And so during that time, it sounds like that's when you decided to become a witch. How did that happen?
So I actually didn't really decide to become a witch. It's a really funny story. I had gotten my own library card. I was very excited because they finally let me into the adult section because I didn't want anything to do with the children's area of the library. And I was just like wandering around. I've always had an interest in mythology and kind of like folklore and like that kind of stuff. And I was walking around like just in between, the various aisles, minding my own business. And I was looking for a copy of Bullfinch's mythology or Bullfinch's fables. Can't remember the name of the book. It's Edith Bullfinch. And while I was sort of like meandering around, I was like moving around books and whatnot and like trying to like reach things on various high shelves. And all of a sudden I had a book fall off one of the shelves and like hit me in the face. And I was just like, what in the world? And the book ended up being Adaine McCoy's If You Want to Be a Witch. And I was just like, I would like to be a witch. What is this about? So I picked up this book and I literally plopped down like in the middle of the library aisle because I was one of those children. And I started like skimming through this book and like looking at this book. And I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, this is how I felt for like a very long time. Like same hand motions too. So I was just like, I need to bring this book home. I need to find out more about this. So I ended up bringing home Adaine's book, and I think I might have also picked up Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner, which is by Scott Cunningham. And I squirreled those little suckers home, like hiding them from my mother so she didn't know like they were intermingled with my other books. And I just devoured them. And I really sort of resonated with this idea of there's more to the world than what we see, and to this idea of being able to affect change. And I've always been very spiritually sensitive. When I was very little, my mother later told me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this story here shortly. But my mother told me that when I was little, because she used to work at a hospital, I would sometimes like have tantrums about like going to see her at the hospital. And I'd be like, oh, they bothered me. Like people bother me. And my mother's just like, what in the world are you talking about, child? And I now in hindsight as an adult, I think it was just like spiritual like information, like people bothering me or whatever it might be. I don't know. Children are weird. And I was
so what you're talking about is mediumship, right? So like, do you have an experience of mediumship now?
Yes, I do actually have several experiences, and that's actually been part of the last like 7-8 years. And it started before that. My first sort of exposure to mediumship was actually when I attempted suicide. I was sexually assaulted and raped and physically abused when I was in my early teens. I was basically brainwashed by an 18-year-old man. And I ended up becoming pregnant as a result of being raped. I also was sexually abused as a child by one of my parents, her father. He sexually abused me for 7 years, almost 7 years, in various ways. So I had a very traumatic, very painful childhood. One of my parents was also severely mentally ill and verbally and emotionally abusive. So when I found out I was pregnant, based on how they had handled me coming forward about my grandfather, I collapsed. Like, I collapsed in on myself, and I ended up overdosing on pain medication. And I got very lucky that my other parent had her mommy spidey sense and was just like, did you take something? Like, what's going on? Like, and she was also a nurse too, so I'm sure that was part of her intuition there. But during that process, while I was in the hospital, I had a dream about a young man who came to me, and he said, I know your mother. It's not your time yet. You and your brother were my gifts to her. And I was just like, these are some mighty strong drugs.
Yeah, you had a lot going on, right? So
yeah, and I was just like, yeah, and I just kind of like thought it was really weird, and like I like fanned it off, and like I didn't pay any mind. And then fast forward a few years later, about 4 years later, I was in a relationship with a young man who mentally like had his own stuff going on. And one night he called me, and he was very much in distress. And that night I had another dream. And it was the same young man who came to me and said, talk to your mother about this, because what had happened was that he was suicidal, and I was very deeply afraid that he was going to hurt himself, and I'd be burying this person that I was planning on marrying, and was moving in that direction. We were both moving in that direction. So I go to my mother, Charlotte, and I said, I have something I need to tell you. Please don't put me back in the mental hospital. Like, please. And she's just like, oh, okay, I can't make any promises. Depends on what you tell me, but I'll do my best. And I started telling her about the dreams that I had and describing this young man. And I distinctly remember like her face literally going pale, and just like her getting really quiet and really still. And I was just like, oh boy, what? Oh no, like, what's going to happen? And the first words she said to me were, I didn't even tell your mother. And I was just like, tell mama what? Like, wait a minute. Turns out that when she was about 18 years old, she was a nursing student at Mary Baldwin, which used to be a women's college. It was a nursing school. Mm-hmm. And it was right down the road from Dartmouth. And at the time, Dartmouth was dudes only, right? Because both of my parents were older. My parent, Charlotte, was born in 1940, to give y'all an idea. Yeah. Yes, they were 45 and 50 when they adopted kids. Like, they were a little late to the party. Yeah. But she went to a frat party with some friends of hers, and she met this young man, and they instantly hit it off, and they started dating. But the thing is that he was Jewish and my mother was Catholic. And back in the day, like, Jewish kids dating Jewish boy with Catholic girl was just as bad as black boy with white girl. So they dated in secret, just because it was just easier to do it that way. And the night that he proposed to my mother, he ended up getting in a car accident on his way home, and he was killed immediately. Like, he hit a tree. Like, it was in the middle of winter. He lost control of his vehicle. He hit a tree and he died. Mm-hmm. So my mother didn't even get to go to the funeral, because nobody knew that they were dating. Her family didn't know. His family didn't know. And it was just a very traumatic loss for my mother. And she didn't tell anybody. Mm-hmm. And she was very much in love with them and was planning on having a life with them. And after that, she just kind of threw herself into her career and just kind of went on with her business. So my mother tells me this, and I'm just like, oh, wow, okay, that's creepy. And I very jokingly said to her, so promise me that when you die, you'll come bother me. She said, yes, baby, I promise. Like, I'll come harass you, like, when I die. Little did I know that literally 2 years later, my mom would pass away. Yeah, so she had a stroke during my first my first week of college finals, my first college finals ever, my mother has a stroke. I drop everything, and for the first time in my entire academic career, I have a GPA well below a 2.0. Like, well, well below a 3.0, because I never had anything less than B's, or rarely did. But I dropped everything because I didn't know if she was going to live or not. And that set off like a whole chain of events that has been like the last 7-8 years, including for me spiritually. Yeah, when the mediumship kind of came roaring back and opened up, and yeah.
So what I hear you saying is that although you didn't have any kind of outside help, you were naturally had an affinity to mediumship, and you naturally had some of this, but you didn't have a container, you didn't have someone to guide you, you didn't really have it. You did have some books, which is very helpful, but it was a natural thing that was occurring for you, and your mother was sure and at least gave you some affirmations that the person that she knew the person that had been talking to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Which, as I said, was kind of like weird to me, because I never like thought of my mother like having a romantic life or, a life, anything else.
With a man.
Or with a man.
Yeah.
So that was like a little jarring. I was like, wait a minute, hold up.
You mean you're a person?
Yeah.
It's part of the growing up. Yeah, we all have it.
Like most 18-year-olds aren't just like, but it's mom.
Yeah.
So like it was jarring on that level. But it was also I kind of brushed it off. Like even then, like I just kind of went, and brushed it off. And I had kind of like a wishy-washy, for lack of a better way to describe it, kind of relationship with the spiritual at that point. I wasn't entirely sure if I believed in God or anything bigger at that point, but I also knew that like the only intellectually honest position was agnosticism. I don't know. I have a preference, but otherwise we can't actually know. So I was kind of like in that boat, and I had floated away from Wicca at that point, and was just kind of cool agnostic teen. And then I went away to college, and the college that I went to was Columbia College, South Carolina. It's a very small little women's college in Columbia, South Carolina, literally. The name tells you where it is. And it was, the entire student body was about 1,500 people. Keep in mind, my graduating class from high school was 750 kids. So it was very much a culture shock for me to go from fairly liberal, open-minded South Florida to deep in the heart of the South, the child of gay parents, as a Black woman who was also kind of wrestling with her sexuality and her spirituality, to a Methodist school or Methodist affiliated school where 90% of the student body and my peers were all very religious Christian girls.
That's an interesting choice.
That full tuition money.
Wow.
Like real talk, like they offered me full tuition. And it was close and it was warm. I was admitted to an Ivy League school, but I didn't want to go. Like I just didn't.
It's okay.
I didn't give a shit. A lot of people, like every time I say that to people, they're just like, but why wouldn't you want to go to Harvard? And I'm just like, because, like, have you seen some of the kids that go to Harvard? Like, they're not exactly my crowd.
Well, neither is this, though.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting choice.
Yeah. And the main, like, the main thing that kind of made a difference was that I would be closer to home, and there wasn't so much pressure. There was a part of me that said, don't go to Cambridge. Don't go that far north. First of all, it's too cold to freeze to death. Second of all, you don't like any of the children. Third, just don't go. Like, you
just
won't.
Wasn't so right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, if I had dropped out of Harvard, that would have emotionally devastated me. That probably would have made me suicidal. Like, I don't think I'd be here if I had gone, against my gut instinct at that point. Because so much of my identity at that stage was wrapped up in intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of always being the smart one. And I think if I had, tanked out of Harvard, like that's a new low, like for me.
It's not, right? Like it is in the experience. And then you're going to
Yeah.
also hold the fact that, you can hold that there was a very valid reason for that to occur.
Yeah.
Right. And,
Yeah.
okay, so now your mom is sick or she passed away? I'm confused.
So when I was at Columbia College, she had her stroke. So she was sick at the time. My other parent, Hilly, her mental illness was starting to get worse because my grandmother's health was declining. So was my grandfather's health. And there's just a lot of stuff going on family-wise. I ended up finishing the year. I came back home. And about 9 months after I came back home was when Charlotte passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And that was devastating. And I still remember that morning crystal clear. I actually felt a pang in my chest. What I later learned was the moment that she died, or the time that they put on her death certificate. She had a heart attack. She went into cardiac arrest and she passed away from sepsis because she had fallen and broken her hip and, complications from that. But about a month after she passed away, one morning I just woke up with like this irrepressible urge to get a tarot deck. Like, I need to get a tarot deck. I don't know why, but I need to.
And you hadn't gotten one prior?
I had one prior. This is the interesting thing. So I had one prior that I had somehow managed to get from Barnes & Noble. I'm still not entirely sure how it came into my possession, but I couldn't read with it because the pips weren't illustrated, and it was just like really like huge. Like it's like the size. It was like the size of my head. Like it was like really hard for me to like hold and shuffle. And the pips weren't illustrated, and to be honest, like the court cards and the majors weren't that greatly illustrated either, but it was kind of a shitty deck. But I kind of toyed with it and I read with it and poked at it a little bit. So I ended up buying 2 decks. I got my first copy of the Radiant Rider-Waite and the traditional Rider-Waite, which is the yellow box, the one that comes in the yellow box. It looks garishly colored, like the illustration is like patently terrible, like. Yeah. So I got these decks and I started doing readings like almost immediately. Like I didn't read any books. I just picked up the cards and I went. And I started doing readings for friends, and I started like researching into it more and taking it more seriously. And just to kind of condense the story and move things along, I ended up kind of falling into the tarot community. And at one point, I was working as a volunteer reader for the American Tarot Association. Like they have like free 1-card readings that you can do. I went to a class while I was still living in Florida at this point. And then at some point in here, after reading for a while, I met this girl who was kind of artsy and cool. Her name was Melissa. And she was just like, oh, you read tarot? That's really cool. I'm organizing like this art and music event at this local, little vegan cafe called Mother Earth Cafe. Would you like to come read? And I was just like, sure, I guess. That's cool. So I was relegated to the porch because Miss Patty didn't want me reading cards in the shop because it pumped up the vibe. And I was reading for tips all night. And towards the end of the night, this Black woman who was older came to me and said, oh, are you doing readings? And I was like, yeah, sure. Yeah, minding my own business. And she sits down and she's just like, well, can I have a reading? And I'm just like, sure. So I'm just going about my business. And at this point, Miss Patty was out on the porch because she smoked, and she was giggling in the corner. And I was just like, why is she laughing? Like, what's so funny? Like, I'm just very confused right now, doing my thing. And I get to the end of the reading, and this woman looks at me and she says, do you know who I am? And I'm like,
no.
No? Should I know who you are? And then all of a sudden she puts on the accent. And it's like this Jamaican accent. And I'm just like, no, it can't be. And it was Miss Cleo. Like, it was Yori. Her real name is Yori. May her soul rest in peace. And she's just like, yeah, so you're very talented. And I was just like,
So I don't know who she is. Tell me
oh,
who
Miss
she is.
Theo and the Psychic Friends Network?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she retired. Apparently she retired to West Palm Beach, like, after, like, she got out of her legal situation, that legal mess. And she had retired to South Florida with her children.
Mm-hmm.
And she was actually there that night because she was a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And she was reading her poetry, which was actually very beautiful and quite potent. She was talking about police brutality and social justice and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And she and I ended up having, like, this long conversation about, like, her spiritual experiences and her spiritual gifts and her experience with the Psychic Friends Network. Because of course I was going to ask about that.
Yeah.
And at some point in this conversation, I remember her saying something to me along the lines of, you know, you have a gift, take care of it, you know, don't squander it. And I was just like super geek because I read tarot for Miss Cleo. Like, what?
Yeah.
Kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So that happened. And tarot was kind of like my first kind of like real serious foray into kind of like this broader spiritual world.
So it seems like you've kind of dabbled in several things while having a pretty intense life.
Yes.
And so what does it look like today? What's the through line and like, where are you at today?
Yeah. So I would say that divination and, you know, divination, which is card readings, looking to the divine, being an oracle, has been the main through line through all of this. It's my intuitive and kind of like spiritual gifts there, if you want to call them that. I just call them this weird shit that I do. And over the course of the years from this period, my mother passed away. My other mother, like, steadily lost her mind. I had to flee from home, like literally flee from home from a very dangerous situation. I started reading tarot for clients, like, on the internet, because I can't drive because I have a chronic migraine condition. So I'm legally not allowed to drive. I had no money, like barely any job history, no degree, nothing. So I started reading tarot on the internet and doing other things, but tarot was the main thing. And doing readings was kind of like how I built up this kind of network and this, like, started building up community on the internet and outside of people that I immediately knew. And at some point in here, while doing energy work for a client, I ended up having my sort of like first deity encounter, like my first sort of like encounter with the divine with the big D. Mm-hmm. And from that, I ended up converting to Pan-Germanic heathenism. So it's the Norse and Germanic, Slavic, Balkan gods and goddesses and sort of like those spiritual beliefs and cosmologies, which I don't know if you know this, I'm Black. So
for those of you who can't see you and are listening to this, and those are not Black.
Yeah, no. That's not exactly like the first choice. People would go, yes, African-American Black woman from, you know, the United States, definitely going to work with Norse deities.
Well, how did that happen?
So the story on that was that I was doing a practice that I called world walking, which for some of you who are familiar with core shamanism and stuff, it's basically journeying. I just use different language for it out of respect. Out of respect to First Nations and Indigenous people. I was world walking on behalf of a client, minding my own business. And in the process of doing this, this woman, this very light-skinned, she was almost shimmery, etheric, blonde-haired woman just kind of shows up. I'm just like, who are you? Why are you here? Mm-hmm. What are you doing here? This is weird. And she comes up to me and, like, she's not talking. I can hear her voice, but she's physically not talking. Her mouth is not moving. And she says, you know, I am Ir. And I'm just like, okay, that's good. Why are you here? And she's just like, because, you know, I want to talk to you. Like, and I have things that I want to share with you, basically. I'm articulating from energy.
Mm-hmm.
So, that wasn't what it was exactly said to me. And then she took my hands in hers, and it was just like this really weird moment. I was like, okay, weird lady, that's cool. I went about my business, and I just kind of brushed it off. And then for several months afterwards, she kept showing up. Every time I would world walk, she would be there. And then all of a sudden, like, Freya shows up. And I'm just like, why are you here? Like, I didn't call any of you. Like, what? Leave me alone. Yeah. And I'm also freaked out because my only exposure to Norse paganism at this point was what I heard when I was a child, like when I was involved with Wicca. And at that point, Asatruar, which is like a form of Norse paganism, had a really bad reputation for white supremacist beliefs and like neo-Nazis, which we still have that problem as a community. And it's gotten worse over the years in some ways. But the general sort of sentiment was the only people who work with Norse deities this way are white supremacists, right? And this community is hostile to people of color. So I was immediately like, no, thank you. I'm good.
Well, also you had a rich tradition being a woman of color, right? So it's an interesting
yes and no. So that's the interesting part.
Okay.
Because at this point, I had only very limited exposure to what you would call the African traditional religions. So Haitian voodoo, Santeria, Lukumi, or Ocho de la Regla, oh my goodness, can't say things. Those types of traditions that come from African cosmologies and African spiritualities. I grew up in South Florida, so Santeria is something that is there, especially down in Miami and then Hialeah. But it wasn't something that I had actively looked at or actively pursued because it just kind of didn't occur to me for whatever reason. And also because there's a lot of mystery and sort of like misconceptions and really ugly political propaganda around those types of beliefs. So I actually didn't have like that body of wisdom that I necessarily registered. And at this point, I was not as politically left and woke as I am now.
Mm-hmm.
I was a light-skinned Black woman raised by two white people and in a predominantly white family. I was still kind of like swimming in the bubble a little.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't occur to me to look to my Blackness because I had no deep conception of my identity as a Black woman at this point.
Okay.
So basically, long story short, I had enough visitations from weird spirits. I met my best friend, Michelle, who happened to be a heathen, practicing heathen as well. And I started reading, and I did my own little ceremony, and I converted in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I had my first exposure to the idea of like formal magic beyond just like Wiccan ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
I purchased on a whim a copy of, well, I had purchased it a couple of years before, but I just hadn't read it for whatever reason. Jason Miller's The Sorceress Secrets. Yes. Yeah. Got a whole bunch of things confused. And I started reading that book, and it was like really instrumental in kind of like opening me up spiritually to different possibilities. And then fast forward 4 years, I'm here now.
Well, what I hear is, do you have any mentors?
Oh,
right.
yes.
Into that, or a community. Like what I've heard is a lot of books and a lot of things like that, but I haven't heard a community. And so is there a community for you?
Yes and no. So I have had a ton of teachers and mentors along the way. My first two spiritual teachers, my very first teacher was actually Karen Hager, the Fog City Psychic. She's really lovely. Mm-hmm. And I took her psychic development class to really kind of like learn how to get a handle on my spiritual and my mediumship gifts, especially the psychic gifts. And then shortly, like after that, I worked with Lisa Wechtenheiser, who now channels Prince, which is awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. But she also taught me a lot about, working with my intuition, and my gut instinct. And then I kind of like wandered alone for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked briefly with Kimberly Arana, who is a really potent medicine woman herself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of wandered a little bit more. And I started learning a lot from Jason Miller, who also goes by Emma. Never mind, I'm not going to say his magical name, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I started learning from him. And then I encountered Josephine McCarthy's body of work. She's one of the teachers of the Korea, which is a magical order. But unlike traditional magical orders, it's, and I don't have a better way to describe it except open source. If you do the work, they have their entire curriculum online, nothing's hidden. You can basically work through their entire curriculum and never have to pay a dime for any books or anything like that. If you want to have formal mentoring, that's available to you. And obviously, you compensate people for their time and labor there. But it's completely open source. And I'm working through the Korea still to this day because it takes several years. I encountered Josephine's work, so I sort of looked to her as like a mentor. And, kept going about my business. And then I met Chris Durkees, who is a dear friend of mine and also one of my mentors at present. And he and I worked together over a period of time. And there are a whole bunch of people. It's like everywhere. I'm constantly learning from others. And it might not always be one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of idea of community, albeit in a really disconnected sense, has always been there for me. But in terms of immediate community, people that I relate to in live time, kind of as a group, that has actually been fairly new. And that actually started because I kicked it off, because I started, and this is not open for members, although people who know me might ask. I have a little secret Facebook group. Now it's not secret anymore. It's just
yeah.
But I have a invite only group where we talk about magic and all sorts of spiritual stuff, but it's not it's a very loosely kind of informal community. And that's always been a point of contention for me, because I do come from a very volatile family background. So this idea of being in community with other people is something that I relate to very much as a hermit and as an introvert and as an outsider. Where I want what's best for the collective, but in terms of actually dealing with other people, sometimes it triggers a lot of my trust issues.
Yeah.
Well,
I am amazed by your story. It sounds like, I really am. What I hear is a combination of you following the intuition, you following, my own personal story is that I really have followed the lit up squares, right? That's how I look at it. And I tend to be heading in a certain direction, but it's really about going, I need this. Oh, look, it appears. I need this. Oh, look, it appears. And in that way I heal and I get more connected. And I really hear that in your story, right? I really hear how, this happens. And then you get the support in perfect time. Right. Yeah. And that, from what I hear you saying, and you can correct me if it's wrong, it's been a very fulfilling path, a hard one, which life tends to be, but it also an incredibly fulfilling path. And you have diligently stayed on it, right? And done the work.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful and hard. And and I really honor that work that you've done.
Thank you. But yeah, that's pretty much been what it is. If I had to describe myself as a practitioner, I would always say that I'm spirit led. Like, I talk to the spirits, I talk to Mother Earth before I listen to humans sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's very much been, just kind of going on faith.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had anything in this life, that is the one thing I seem to have. And like the tiniest, like the whole thing about the faith the size of a mustard seed.
Yeah.
That's me. Like my faith is so like itty bitty bitty, like in some ways, but it's also like what's contained in that space is just, I don't know how to articulate it. I have a boundless amount of faith. I don't know why. Don't know how. I shouldn't after all of the things I've been through.
I mean, I could argue you should. You've had all these gifts. You've had all these like visitations. You've had all, you know what I mean? Like there are ways in which you have totally had this like very dramatic, really intense experience. I mean, I think on both, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've lost a parent really, really young. You've had really tragic experiences. And then you also had visitations and, dead people talking to you, like that's a lot.
Yeah. And funnily enough, well, it's not funny, but enough. It was a couple of years ago. So a couple of years ago, my second parent, my mentally ill parent, committed suicide. And that absolutely destroyed me.
Yeah.
Because she passed away the day after her birthday. And if anybody had told me that my last words to my mother would be, "I love you and I'll talk to you later," I wouldn't have believed them, because we went for a whole like year where we just did not speak.
Yeah.
And so when she died, like, it just absolutely destroyed me, wrecked me. And I literally crawled in bed and did not get out of bed for 2 months, and was thinking about having myself hospitalized because I was just like in that deep and dark of a place. And oddly enough, her passing that way and sort of having to go through this whole grieving experience, and also having to deal with family and legal stuff and the aftermath of this occasion, has really galvanized my relationship with spirit and with the spiritual. Because it brought up a tremendous amount of existential pain. I don't really have any other way to describe that. And if there's anybody else in the audience who has lost a loved one to suicide, that survivor's grief, like that survivor's guilt and grief, and the gravity of the pain that comes with that type of loss, especially knowing that the person that you love suffered the way that they were suffering so much that they felt this was their only way out. It does a lot to you. And it was actually kind of like in that moment where I just kind of shouted out to the universe, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with this pain. I don't know how to be here. And I did actually start to come back to my roots, my biological roots, as a Black woman, as a Native woman, because my birth mother is actually half Cherokee, and sort of like rooting back into that lineage that I had felt really disconnected from for whatever reason. Well, I mean, I know why I felt disconnected. I shouldn't say for whatever reason. I know the exact reasons. But that has been tremendously healing. If anybody had told me that losing my mother that way would yield wholeness for me, I wouldn't have believed them.
Yeah, I think these. I think that there's a line in a practice that I do, and they say, you stand at the turning point, and we stand at the turning point, And there are small turning points for sure, but there's also really big ones. And those big ones when you're just knocked on the floor and cannot move. And one of the reasons I do this podcast is to really talk about a spiritual life. Like, it's really easy for me to come up here and be like, oh my God, it's so amazing. And I just listen to what God says and it's awesome. And that is true, right? And that's really easy to have that public persona or talk about it in that space. But it's also like me on the floor, sobbing, ugly crying, cannot move. What do I do now? I have no choice. And that opening that gets created in that type of particular pain is a deeper and more intense opening when you then say, all right, let's do this.
Yeah. And
it's, you know, my goal in life is to have that opening without such pain. Like, that's really what I'm fighting for, right? I'm fighting to get to that space of total surrender without loss like that. And I you know, it's still a choice. Like, you still chose it. You chose this life, you chose this path, and you chose spirit. And that is, and even if your spirit is Jesus, and if your spirit is like whatever that spirit is for you, that's what you chose. And in the world according to me today, you know, that request sent out is responded to. And that's what I hear you saying, right? That request sent out is responded to. And I think that in those moments, in such dire straits, which, you know, that request, you hit that ball out of the park, right? In that moment, you're just like, this, right? I need this. And then that got responded to, right? And healed you in a way that wasn't healed prior, right? Like, that's the thing that I find so beautiful is that, like, yes, you had such deep, deep, deep pain. And what I hear you saying is the response back was such deep healing. Sure. We're out of time. So I wanted to say thank you so much. I honor the fact that you were so open and willing to tell us your entire story and to be so vulnerable with this is your path. And I really appreciate that. And I think that for me is how other people, you know, my goal is to have people who are sitting there by themselves go, oh my gosh, me too.
Yeah.
Right. And you gave that to people today.
Well, I'm glad I could share my story. Thank you for having me on. I apologize for being a little bit rambly in there. I'm not used to being asked to just tell the story. Usually I just have to kind of like drive through the version.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I don't think you were rambling. I trust in spirit, right? Yeah. I trust that what got to come out came out. Yeah. And what we'll do is we'll have some links in the notes to how to get a hold of you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
To how to see your work, and also some links into all of the people we talked about, right? So we want to give people that opportunity because I know you're still doing readings for people, yes?
Yes, I am. So like how that shows, like just all the spiritual stuff now shows up for me is very much related to social justice, but also to how we relate to resources and to one another and with Mother Earth. So I'm an anti-capitalist business strategist. I work with businesses who want to be a part of dismantling capitalism and, you know, building up a more sustainable, equitable, just and kind and compassionate replacement for the economic system that we've been given. But I also am very much still in my village witch space. I do ancestor work now, and I'm adding some more things like as I go along. But I'm always available to like village witch. Like people just are just like, can you help me with this? I'm just like, sure. Let's throw some cards. Let's see what the spirits have to say. You know. Yeah. So yes, I'm still very much in that space. I'm always happy to talk with people and connect as I can. So yeah, sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. And everyone will find a way to connect on at coachleslie.com/podcast, and it'll have all that information for you.
Awesome.
All right. Bye for now.